All right, let's dive into another deep dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at a subject that might seem, well, pretty straightforward at first glance. Breasts. But trust me, there's a whole lot more to discover here.
Absolutely. There's so much going on beneath the surface.
We'll be using a YouTube video as our guide for this deep dive.
Okay.
It's from the Institute of Human Anatomy.
Cool.
And it's called Why Breasts Are So Important. We're going to be talking about milk production, the role of hormones, and even taking a look at how breast augmentation works.
It's amazing how often breasts are kind of viewed through this very narrow lens of just aesthetics when their biological function is so honestly mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's true. Like, we all know they're involved in feeding babies, but I have a feeling there's probably a lot more to that story than I even realize. So let's start with the basics. What exactly are breasts made of, like from a purely anatomical standpoint?
Okay, so picture this. Hemispherical projections, primarily composed of mammary glands, connective tissue, and of course, a good amount of adipose tissue, better known as fat.
Fat, got it. So it's not just one thing. It's this whole combination of different tissues working together. And I know hormones play a huge role, especially during puberty.
Oh, absolutely. That's when estrogen, produced by the ovaries, really takes center stage. It triggers the development of that breast tissue, stimulates the growth of those mammary glands, increases fat deposition.
So that's ultimately what's contributing to the size and shape of the breasts.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But this is where I always start to get a little lost. Where exactly do breasts actually fit in with, like, the rest of our anatomy? What are they attached to, and how do they, stay up?
So they actually sit on top of the pectoralis major muscle.
Okay.
And kind of partially cover a muscle on the side called the serratus anterior.
Okay.
They're anchored to these muscles by a layer of fascia and supported by these connective tissue strands called suspensory ligaments. You might also hear them called Cooper's ligaments.
Cooper's ligaments. Okay. It's like their own built-in scaffolding system, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I've heard those ligaments can loosen over time. Is that what causes sagging?
It's definitely a factor. I mean, age plays a role, but strain can really accelerate that process.
Yeah, okay.
Thinking high-impact activities like running, jumping, especially without proper support, those repetitive, jarring motions can really stretch and weaken those ligaments over time.
Got it. So that's why sports bras are so important.
Exactly.
Especially for activities that put a lot of stress on those ligaments. It's like giving your breasts their own personal suspension system.
A good sports bra can make a huge difference in maintaining the integrity of those ligaments.
I'll keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on to, the main event here, milk production. We know the mammary glands are the milk-making factories, but I have to admit I'm a little fuzzy on how the whole process actually works.
Well, get ready to be amazed because it is quite intricate.
Boy.
Each mammary gland is made up of these lobes, anywhere from 15 to 20 of them. And each lobe contains these even smaller compartments called lobules. And then if you zoom in even further, you find these grape-like clusters called alveoli.
Wait, so each of these lobes is made up of even smaller structures. It's lobes and then lobules and then alveoli. It's like a biological Russian nesting doll.
Exactly. Those alveoli are lined with specialized cells that actually produce the milk.
Okay. But I know milk production doesn't just magically happen, right? There's a whole hormonal symphony going on behind the scenes.
Right. And this is where the pituitary gland comes in. It's this tiny but powerful gland located in the brain. And it plays a key role in regulating a lot of bodily functions, including, during pregnancy, it releases this hormone called prolactin, which stimulates lactation. In fact, prolactin levels steadily rise throughout pregnancy, increasing 10 to 20-fold by the time the baby is born.
So the body's really getting ready for that milk production way before the baby even arrives. But hold on. If prolactin levels are so high during pregnancy, why don't women start, lactating then?
That's where things get really interesting. So the placenta, which, nourishes the baby in the womb, also releases large amounts of estrogen and progesterone. And these hormones actually inhibit milk secretion, essentially putting a temporary pause on prolactin's milk-making effects.
So it's like this delicate hormonal balancing act going on, but then after childbirth, the placenta is delivered and suddenly...
Exactly. Estrogen and progesterone levels plummet, and prolactin is finally free to do its thing. That's when milk production really kicks into high gear. But in the first few days after birth, something pretty special happens.
You mean colostrum?
Exactly.
I've heard it's like liquid gold for newborns.
It really is. It's this incredible first milk. And it's packed with antibodies, white blood cells, vitamins, minerals, and growth factors.
Oh, wow.
It's not just about calories. It's about giving that baby's immune system a massive boost right from the start.
Wow. It really is liquid gold. It's amazing how perfectly designed this whole system is. But even with all that milk ready to go, there's still the question of actually getting it out. Enter the fascinating process of milk ejection, or as many people call it, letdown.
Right. And letdown is all about this cascade of signals and responses.
Okay.
When a baby suckles at the breast, it triggers sensory nerves in the nipple.
Okay.
It's like sending a message saying, hey, we need some milk over here.
Doesn't that much milk production put a huge strain on the mother's body, though?
Oh, for sure. It definitely requires a lot of energy.
Yeah.
But the body is remarkably adaptable.
Yeah, I guess so.
Breastfeeding mothers actually burn an extra 600 to 750 calories per day, sometimes even more, just from producing milk.
So it's like a built-in workout.
Exactly.
Okay, back to letdown. Those signals from the nipple, where do they actually go?
They travel up the spinal cord to the hypothalamus in the brain. And the hypothalamus then sends a message to the pituitary gland, which triggers the release of more prolactin to keep the milk supply going. But it also releases another crucial hormone, oxytocin.
Ah, the love hormone. I knew oxytocin had to be involved somehow, but what does it do in this case?
Well, it's known for its role in bonding, but it also has this very specific job in milk ejection.
Okay.
When oxytocin reaches the breasts, it causes these special cells called myoepithelial cells to contract.
Okay.
These cells surround the alveoli, those tiny milk-filled sacs we talked about earlier.
Right, so it's like squeezing those sacs to actually push the milk out.
Exactly. That contraction propels the milk into the ducts, making it available for the baby to drink.
This is like blowing my mind, but I have to ask, when the baby's suckling on one breast, does the other one just sit there doing nothing?
Not at all. Suckling on one breast actually triggers milk ejection in both breasts. It's like a two-for-one deal.
That's awesome. Now, that's what I call teamwork. And speaking of fascinating facts, you mentioned something earlier about the hypothalamus and emotions playing a role in milk letdown too, right?
Yes. So the hypothalamus isn't just involved in hormonal signaling. It's also a key player in regulating our emotions.
Got it.
That's why things like, fondling the baby or even hearing the baby cry can trigger milk letdown.
Okay.
The emotional stimulus is processed by the hypothalamus, which then sets off that same chain reaction we just described.
So it's not just about the physical act of suckling. There's this whole emotional component at play as well. I love how this deep dive is revealing all these interconnected layers. But before we get too carried away with hormones and emotions here, let's take a closer look at what breast milk is actually made of.
All right. So human breast milk is about 88.5% water, which makes sense. But it also contains 3.3% fat.
Okay.
6.8% lactose, that's the main carbohydrate in milk.
Okay.
0.9% casein, the primary protein. 0.4% lactoalbumin and other proteins. And about 0.2% minerals, like calcium and things like that.
Wow, that's a pretty complex recipe. How does that actually compare to, say, like cow's milk?
There are some similarities, but also some key differences. Human milk has significantly more lactose than cow's milk, but less protein.
Huh.
And crucially, it contains those antibodies and white blood cells that we talked about earlier, which are so important for immune support.
Right. So it's not just about like nutrition, it's also about building that baby's defenses. But speaking of the amazing properties of breast milk, it's interesting how like our culture also places a lot of emphasis on, the appearance of breasts. And that brings us to the topic of breast augmentation.
Right. And while natural breast shape and size are largely determined by the size of those mammary glands and the amount of adipose tissue,
Yeah.
there's also this societal fascination with enhancing breast size through surgical means.
Let's talk about breast augmentation. It's a topic that, sparks a lot of curiosity. What are some of the main things that people kind of consider when they're thinking about getting implants?
One of the biggest decisions is implant placement. You'll often hear about two main options.
Yeah.
Subglandular and submuscular.
Okay. Those sound pretty technical. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. So, subglandular placement means the implant is placed over the muscle,
Okay.
specifically the pectoralis major muscle. It sits below the natural breast tissue, but above the muscle. Submuscular placement, on the other hand, means the implant is tucked underneath the pectoralis major muscle.
Got it. So it all kind of comes down to where that implant sits in relation to that muscle. But why would someone choose one placement over the other?
Well, it really depends on a few factors, including the amount of existing breast tissue. So for someone with less natural breast tissue, subglandular placement might not be ideal because the implant could be more visible or create rippling.
Okay.
In those cases, submuscular placement might be a better option because the muscle helps to hide the implant, giving it a more natural look.
So submuscular placement is almost like giving the implant a little extra camouflage.
Exactly. But there are trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
Submuscular placement can be more painful and have a longer recovery time. There's also a chance of the implant moving slightly due to muscle contractions.
Makes sense.
Subglandular placement, while potentially showing more rippling, generally has an easier recovery.
It sounds like a classic balancing act of pros and cons, just like everything else we've talked about today.
You got it. And that's precisely why it's so crucial to consult with a qualified plastic surgeon to determine the best approach for each individual's needs and goals.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Wow, we've covered so much ground already. From hormones to milk production to breast augmentation, it's clear that there's a lot more to breasts than meets the eye.
It's pretty remarkable how much we've already learned about breasts just from that one YouTube video.
Right. And to think, there are probably entire textbooks dedicated to this topic.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure they, dive even deeper into the nuances of breast development and milk composition and the long-term health benefits of breastfeeding.
Speaking of milk composition, I'm kind of curious, what makes human breast milk so unique compared to, the milk of other mammals? I mean, besides the obvious fact that it comes from humans, right?
That's a great question. One key difference is actually in the types of proteins that are found in human milk versus, say, cow's milk.
Okay.
While both types of milk contain proteins like casein and whey, the ratio of these proteins is significantly different.
Okay, so what's the big deal about different protein ratios? Is one better than the other?
Well, casein tends to form curds in the stomach, which can be, tougher to digest. Human milk has a lower casein to whey ratio than cow's milk, so it forms softer curds that are easier for babies to break down.
Ah, so it's gentler on their tiny tummies.
Precisely. And whey proteins are more easily digested and absorbed. They also contain important antibodies that help bolster the baby's immune system.
So it's not just about providing calories, it's about providing the right kind of nutrients in the right proportions to really help that baby grow and develop.
Exactly. And another key difference actually lies in the fat content. So human milk has a higher proportion of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, like DHA and ARA.
Those sound familiar. Aren't those the ones that are, crucial for brain development?
Yes. They are essential for brain growth, cognitive function, vision development, and human milk provides these vital fats in a form that's very easily absorbed by the baby. It's like nature's perfect brain food.
Wow. I'm starting to understand why there's such a big push for breastfeeding.
Oh, absolutely. And the benefits extend far beyond just nutrition, too. Breastfeeding has been shown to reduce the risk of certain infections, allergies, and even chronic diseases later in life.
Seriously, so it's not just about the baby's, immediate health. It can have long-term implications as well.
Exactly. Studies have shown that breastfed babies have a lower risk of developing ear infections, respiratory illnesses, diarrhea. There's even evidence suggesting a reduced risk of conditions like obesity, type 1 diabetes, and childhood leukemia.
Wow. It's incredible to think that something as, seemingly simple as breastfeeding can have such a profound impact on a child's health, both in the short and long term.
It really is a powerful example of how nature has designed this intricate system to give babies the best possible start in life. And it's not just beneficial for the baby. Breastfeeding also has positive effects on the mother's health, too.
Oh, tell me more. What kind of benefits are we talking about?
Well, for starters, breastfeeding releases hormones like oxytocin and prolactin, which we've talked about, which have calming and mood-boosting effects. It can also help the mother's uterus contract back to its normal size after delivery.
So it's like a natural stress reliever and recovery aid all in one.
Exactly. And in the long term, breastfeeding has been linked to a reduced risk of certain types of cancer, including breast and ovarian cancer.
Wow, it really does seem like a win-win situation for both mom and baby.
It is. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that not all mothers are able to breastfeed or choose to do so, and that's perfectly okay. Formula feeding is a safe and healthy alternative. The important thing is that babies are receiving the nourishment they need to thrive.
Totally agree. Fed is best no matter how it happens. We've talked a lot about the, biological importance of breasts, especially when it comes to milk production. But I kind of want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, their role in aesthetics. We touched on breast augmentation a little bit, but I'm wondering, what are some of the societal and cultural factors that influence our perceptions of breasts?
That's a very complex question with a long and fascinating history.
Yeah.
Breasts have been viewed and portrayed in countless ways throughout art, literature, and popular culture.
It's true, from ancient fertility goddesses to modern day magazine covers. Breasts have always held this certain allure. But why is that?
Well, I think those depictions often reflect the prevailing social norms and beauty standards of the time. In some cultures, breasts are primarily seen as symbols of motherhood and nourishment, while in others, they're more heavily sexualized.
And it's interesting how those perceptions can vary so widely, across different cultures and even within the same culture over time.
Absolutely. For example, in the Victorian era, modesty was highly valued and breasts were largely concealed. But in the 20th century, with the rise of the women's liberation movement, there was a shift towards greater body positivity and a wider acceptance of different breast sizes and shapes.
And it feels like that evolution is kind of continuing today, with movements like body neutrality and the celebration of diversity. But it still feels like there's a lot of pressure on women to conform to certain ideals when it comes to their bodies, and especially their breasts.
There is. And with social media playing such a prominent role in our lives, we're constantly bombarded with images and messages that can perpetuate those unrealistic beauty standards. It's a constant conversation, and it's important to remember that there's no one right way to view breasts or any other part of our bodies.
That's such an important point. Each person's relationship with their body is so unique and should be respected.
Couldn't agree more.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity and importance of breasts, both from a biological and a societal perspective. It's kind of amazing how much we take for granted about these incredible structures.
I think that's the beauty of deep dives. They allow us to explore these familiar topics in a whole new light and uncover those hidden layers of meaning and significance.
And sometimes they even challenge our assumptions and make us kind of rethink our perspectives, which is always a good thing.
It's all about expanding our understanding and embracing those fascinating intricacies of the world around us.
Well, on that note, I think we've earned ourselves a break. But don't go anywhere just yet. We'll be back with part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll tackle some listener questions and explore some of the considerations surrounding breast augmentation. Stay tuned.
And we're back for part 3 of our deep dive. We've been talking all about breasts, everything from those biological marvels to the cultural baggage that comes along with them. It's been quite a journey, from the ins and outs of milk production to those fascinating historical perspectives on how breasts have been viewed throughout time.
It's wild how much we just kind of take for granted. But before we wrap up, I know we have some listener questions, especially about breast augmentation.
All right, let's get to those questions. It's definitely a topic that sparks a lot of interest.
Totally. Okay, so our first question comes from Sarah, and she asks, what are the potential risks and complications associated with breast augmentation?
It's important to remember, like with any surgical procedure, breast augmentation does carry some inherent risks.
So it's not just about, picking the right implant or placement. There are other things to consider, too.
Absolutely. Some potential complications include infection,
Okay.
bleeding, something called capsular contracture. That's when scar tissue forms around the implant. Implant rupture is also a possibility, and even changes in breast sensation.
Those sound pretty serious. What are some steps that someone can take to kind of minimize those risks?
Choosing a board-certified plastic surgeon is absolutely essential. Someone with, extensive experience specifically in breast augmentation. It's also super important to have realistic expectations about the outcome.
Right.
Breast augmentation is a major surgery, and there's just no guarantee of perfect results.
That makes total sense. It's so important to go into it understanding, both the potential benefits and the risks.
Absolutely.
Our next question comes from James. He asks, are there any alternatives to breast augmentation for people who want to enhance their breast size or shape?
That's a great question. For those looking for less invasive options, there are a few alternatives to consider.
Like what? Fill me in.
One option is fat grafting, also known as breast augmentation with fat transfer.
Okay.
So this involves taking fat from one area of the body, like the abdomen or thighs,
Yeah.
and injecting it into the breasts.
So it's kind of like using your own body's natural filler.
Exactly. The result can be more subtle than implants, but it's a less invasive procedure with fewer potential complications.
That sounds promising. What about those miracle creams and supplements that you see advertised that claim to increase breast size? Are those even legitimate options?
Unfortunately, there's really no scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of those products. Most of them are just marketing hype, preying on people's desire for a quick fix.
Yeah. I guess those miracle creams are about as effective as wishing on a star, huh? It sounds like, if you're really looking to make a significant change, surgery or fat grafting are probably the most reliable options.
That's generally the case, yes. But it's super important to remember that beauty comes in all shapes and sizes, and there's no right or wrong breast size.
Well said. Speaking of those societal pressures, we have a question from Emily. She asks, how can we actually challenge those unrealistic beauty standards that often lead people to consider breast augmentation in the first place?
It starts with, I think, promoting body positivity and celebrating diversity.
So embracing all body types and recognizing that beauty isn't a one-size-fits-all concept.
Absolutely. We need to challenge those kind of narrow and often unattainable standards that are, portrayed in the media and all over social media.
And really shift the focus from external validation to internal well-being.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And speaking of well-being, we have one final question here from Alex. They ask, what advice would you give to someone who is considering breast augmentation?
That is a big decision. My advice would be to, do your research, consult with a qualified plastic surgeon, and most importantly, listen to your own inner voice.
Yeah. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not because of societal pressures or someone else's expectations.
Exactly. Breast augmentation is a personal choice, and it's essential to feel confident and comfortable with your decision.
Such good advice, and I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive has been, well, it's been incredible. We've learned so much about the biology, the cultural significance, and even the personal choices that, surround breasts.
It's been a pleasure exploring all those facets with you.
And with you, our amazing listeners. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we hope you learned something new or maybe even challenged some of your own assumptions along the way.
Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand about our bodies and the world around us, the better equipped we are to make those informed choices.
So go forth and spread that knowledge, and until next time, keep diving deep.
Farewell, fellow knowledge seekers.